In the summer of 1519, a small fleet of Spanish ships dropped anchor on the coast of what is now Mexico. Around 600 men stepped onto the sand. 2 years later, an empire of more than 5 million people was on its knees. The capital, one of the largest and most beautiful cities on earth, was a smoking ruin, sinking back into the lake it had been built upon. The Aztecs, who had ruled central Mexico for nearly a century, who had collected tribute from every corner of their world, who had built temples taller than the cathedrals of Europe, were gone. But here is the thing nobody tells you. The Aztecs were not destroyed by 600 Spaniards. They were not defeated by gunpowder and steel alone. The story of their fall is far stranger, far more uncomfortable and far more human than the version most of us were taught in school. Because what really brought down the Aztec Empire was not a foreign army. It was a combination of their own enemies, an invisible killer no one could see, and a civilization that in many ways was already eating itself from within. Let us go back, far back, to a wandering, despised people who slept in the reeds of a swamp because nobody else wanted them. And let us follow them all the way to the moment their world ended. The Aztecs did not come out of nowhere. They were not the first civilization in central Mexico, and they would not be the last. Long before them, the great city of Teotihuacan rose on the high plateau, with its enormous pyramids of the sun and the moon, ruling over 250,000 people at its peak. Long before them, the Maya carved astronomical observatories out of the jungle. Long before them, the Toltecs left a memory of warriors and craftsmen so powerful that every later people, including the Aztecs themselves, would claim them as ancestors. By the time the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico, the land had already been farmed, fought over, and prayed over for thousands of years. The Aztecs arrived late. They called themselves the Mexica, and according to their own oral tradition, they had migrated from a place in the north called Aztlan, which means the place of whiteness, or the place of herons. We do not know exactly where Aztlan was, or even if it was a single real place. What we do know is that around the 12th century, a small, hungry, semi-nomadic group walked into the Valley of Mexico looking for a home. Nobody wanted them. The valley was already full. Every patch of fertile land already belonged to a city-state that had been there for generations. The Mexica were treated as outsiders, mercenaries, beggars. They were pushed from one master to another. They picked up local languages, local gods, and local technologies, but they were never welcome. At one point, the rulers of a neighboring city were so disgusted by them that they drove them out into the worst patch of swamp they could find and told them to live there or die. Their priests, however, told them something different. Their priests said that they were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and the sun. And Huitzilopochtli had given them a sign. They would know they had arrived at their true home when they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. That image, an eagle on a cactus with a snake in its beak, is on the flag of Mexico to this day. According to the legend, they finally saw it on a marshy, mosquito-ridden island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Nobody else wanted that island, so that is where they built. And on that island, in the year 1325, they founded a city called Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan should not have worked. It was a swamp. The land was unstable, the water was brackish. The ground had to be reinforced with sunken cages of stones and timber to hold up any building of weight. To grow food, the Mexica engineered floating gardens called chinampas, narrow strips of fertile silt anchored to the lakebed by willow trees. To get drinking water into the city, They built aqueducts of stone that ran for kilometers across the lake. To move around, they cut canals through the city itself so that every neighborhood could be reached by canoe as easily as by foot. The result was a place that visitors compared to Venice, except larger, cleaner, and built without a single beast of burden. By the time the Spanish first laid eyes on it in 1519, Tenochtitlan housed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Larger than Paris, larger than London, larger than any city in Spain. It was clean. It had a system of public toilets with human waste collected and used as fertilizer. The streets were swept every day. There were dedicated markets where, according to the Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz, 60,000 people gathered on a single day to buy and sell everything from gold and feathers to medicinal herbs and slaves. There were zoos, there were botanical gardens, there were schools, both for the nobility and, remarkably for the era, compulsory schooling of a kind for commoner boys and girls. At the heart of it all stood the Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramid dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc and to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war who had brought them to this place. From its summit, you could see the whole valley, ringed by volcanoes, fed by lakes, alive with smoke and noise. But Tenochtitlan was not just a beautiful city. It was the engine of an empire. Through a system of conquest and tribute, the Mexica and their allies, the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, brought hundreds of smaller polities under their thumb. Tribute flowed in constantly. Cotton cloaks by the tens of thousands, cacao beans by the millions, jade, quetzal feathers, maize, slaves, war captives, and here we have to be honest, because this is part of why the empire fell. The Aztec religion demanded blood, not metaphorically, literally. Their cosmology taught that the sun, every single day, was engaged in a desperate battle to rise and cross the sky. Without human blood, the sun would lose, the world would end. To prevent that, the gods needed to be fed, and the food they wanted was the still-beating heart of a human being. This was not a small or hidden practice. At the dedication of the rebuilt Templo Mayor in 1487, the Mexica priests sacrificed thousands of war captives over the course of 4 days. Estimates vary widely, but contemporary accounts describe queues of victims stretching out of the city, their hearts cut out at the top of the pyramid and their bodies tumbling down the steps. The exact number is disputed, but the scale was enormous, and it was meant to be enormous because every drop of blood was a political message. The empire was telling the surrounding cities exactly what would happen to them if they refused to pay tribute. Most of the people sacrificed were not citizens of Tenochtitlan. They were captives taken from neighboring cities. The Mexica even institutionalized a strange kind of war, the so-called Flower War, in which they would fight prearranged battles with rivals like Tlaxcala for the explicit purpose of capturing prisoners to sacrifice. To the Mexica, this was a sacred duty. To the people of Tlaxcala, and to the dozens of other cities forced to send their sons up the steps of the temple, it was a nightmare that went on for generations. By the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was at its height. It controlled millions of people. It collected unimaginable wealth. But it was also surrounded by enemies who hated it with a depth that is hard to put into words. And those enemies were waiting, they were watching, they were ready, if anyone gave them the smallest opening, to break the chain. In 1519, that opening arrived. His name was Hernán Cortés. He was 34 years old, ambitious, deeply in debt, and operating without proper authority from anyone above him. He had sailed from Cuba with around 600 men, 16 horses, a handful of small cannons, and a desperate need to find something, anything, that could justify the expedition before the governor of Cuba caught up with him and stripped him of command. He landed near what is now Veracruz in April 1519, and almost immediately, 3 things happened that would change history. First, Cortes did something that should have ended his expedition before it began. He ordered his ships scuttled. Some accounts say he burned them. Either way, the message to his men was the same. There was no going back. They would either march into the unknown and find a kingdom, or they would die in the trying. Second, he found a translator, or rather, he found 2 translators who, between them, could finally connect his world to the world he had walked into. One was a Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, a shipwreck survivor who had lived among the Maya for years. The other was a young woman, sold into slavery as a child, who spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish called her Dona Marina. The indigenous people of Mexico would come to call her La Malinche. Through her, Cortes could finally hear what was being said around him. And what was being said was that the great king on the lake, Moctezuma, was hated. Third, almost as soon as Cortes began his march inland, he encountered the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans were the Mexica's oldest and bitterest enemies. They had resisted absorption into the empire for generations. They had lost sons in flower wars for as long as anyone could remember. At first, they fought the Spanish hard. Cortes took heavy losses, but once it became clear that these strange newcomers were also enemies of Tenochtitlan, the Tlaxcalans made an offer. They would not fight Cortes. They would join him. This is the part of the story that gets lost in school books. The conquest of Mexico was not Spanish versus Aztec. It was Spanish plus tens of thousands of indigenous allies versus Aztec. By the time Cortes finally marched on Tenochtitlan, he had a Spanish corps of perhaps 600 men, surrounded by an army of Tlaxcalans, Cholulans, Totonacs, and other native warriors, numbering in the tens of thousands. The Aztec Empire was not brought down by Europeans. It was brought down by people it had been brutalizing for 100 years, who finally saw their chance. In November 1519, Cortes arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan. He crossed the long causeway over the lake with his men, his Tlaxcalan allies behind him, and was met by Moctezuma II, the 9th ruler of the Aztec Empire, in person. Bernal Diaz, who was there, would write decades later that the sight of the city took the breath out of his men. They thought they were dreaming. They had never seen anything like it. What happened next is one of the most argued over moments in the history of the Americas. Moctezuma did not fight. He welcomed Cortes. He gave him gifts of gold. He housed the Spaniards in one of the royal palaces inside the city. Why? The traditional story, the one told by some Spanish chroniclers and repeated for centuries, is that Moctezuma believed Cortes was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent who had been prophesied to come back from the east. This story is almost certainly a later invention, partly Spanish self-flattery, and partly a way for surviving Aztec nobles to explain a decision that, in hindsight, looked catastrophic. The likelier truth is that Moctezuma was a careful, intelligent ruler who was trying to manage a situation he did not fully understand. He had spies. He had heard about the Spaniards for months. He knew they had defeated Tlaxcala in pitched battle, and he knew they had then somehow turned Tlaxcala into an ally. He could not tell whether they were men or something else. He probably decided that bringing them into the city, where they were vastly outnumbered, was safer than fighting them in the open. Inside Tenochtitlan, surrounded by 250,000 Mexica, 600 Spaniards could be controlled, or so he thought. For weeks, the two leaders coexisted in an uneasy truce. Cortes met the emperor. He saw the great markets, the temples, the floating gardens. He climbed the Templo Mayor and looked down on a city that was, in every measurable sense, more advanced than any city he had ever seen in Europe. And at some point, he made a decision. He took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. For several months, Cortes ruled Tenochtitlan through Moctezuma. The emperor still gave orders, still received tribute, still appeared in public, but he was a prisoner of the Spanish. Tribute now flowed partly into Spanish hands. Demands for gold became constant. The Mexican nobility, watching their king reduced to a pageant, began to lose patience. Then Cortes had to leave. The governor of Cuba, the same governor whose authority Cortes had ignored, had finally sent a force to arrest him. Cortes took most of his men back down to the coast, defeated the rival Spanish expedition in a single night, and absorbed its survivors into his own command. While he was away, command of Tenochtitlan fell to one of his lieutenants, a man named Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado made a decision that destroyed everything. During a religious festival in honor of Huitzilopochtli, while thousands of Mexican nobles and warriors were gathered in the temple precinct, dressed in their finest feathers and dancing without weapons, Alvarado ordered his men to attack. They blocked the exits and slaughtered everyone inside. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of unarmed Mexica died in what is remembered as the Massacre of the Templo Mayor. The city erupted. By the time Cortes returned, the truce was finished. The Spanish were trapped in their compound. Moctezuma, brought out onto a balcony to plead for calm, was hit by stones thrown by his own people and died days later. Whether he was killed by the Mexica or by the Spanish, who no longer needed him, is still debated. Either way, he was gone. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortes tried to escape the city. The Spanish, weighed down with stolen gold, crept out along one of the causeways in the dark. They were spotted. The drums sounded from the top of the Templo Mayor. Mexica warriors came at them from the lake in canoes and from the causeway behind. The bridge over one of the gaps in the road collapsed under the weight of men and horses. What followed was a slaughter. Hundreds of Spaniards drowned in the lake, dragged down by the gold they refused to drop. Thousands of Tlaxcalans died with them. The Spanish remember this night as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Cortes, by his own account, sat down under a tree at dawn and wept. It looked, at that moment, as if the conquest was over. The Aztec Empire had defended itself. Its capital was intact. Its new ruler, Cuitlahuac, was on the throne. The Spanish had been driven into exile, their numbers cut nearly in half. Cortes had nothing left. But while the Mexica celebrated, something else was already inside the city. Something that had crossed the lake long before any Spaniards set foot on the causeway. It came on the body of an enslaved African man who had traveled with the Spanish reinforcements from Cuba. His name, in some accounts, was Francisco de Eguia. He carried smallpox. The Mexica had never seen smallpox before. Nobody in the Americas had. The continent had been isolated from Eurasian disease pools for tens of thousands of years. There were no inherited immunities, no folk remedies, no priestly traditions for handling the symptoms. When the disease landed, It landed in a population with absolutely no defense. It tore through Tenochtitlan. The fever came first, then the rash, then the pustules covering the entire body. Survivors described people unable to walk, unable to lie down without pain, dying in their own beds because no one was healthy enough to bring them water. Whole families went under at once. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, the man who had driven the Spanish out, contracted smallpox and died within 80 days of taking the throne. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, a young man who became the last ruler of independent Tenochtitlan, inherited a city that was already half dead. Modern estimates suggest that the smallpox epidemic of 1520 killed somewhere between a quarter and a half of the entire population of central Mexico in a matter of months. The dead were so numerous that there was no one left to bury them. Houses were sealed up around the bodies. The smell, according to one Spanish account, hung over the city for weeks. This is the part of the story that no military analyst can really reckon with. By the time Cortes came back, with new ships, new cannons, fresh reinforcements, and an enormous Tlaxcalan army, he was not fighting the Aztec Empire he had fled. He was fighting the survivors. He was fighting a city in mourning. He was fighting an army whose generals were dying as fast as they could be replaced. The Mexica were the most powerful people in central Mexico, and they were also a people who, biologically, had just been hit by something none of them had a name for. Cortes returned to the valley in late 1520. This time, he did not march straight into the city. He had learned. He spent months building 13 small ships called brigantines in pieces in Tlaxcala, then carrying the pieces over the mountains and assembling them on the lake. With those ships, the Spanish controlled the water. Tenochtitlan, the city built on water, had its greatest strength turned against it. He cut off the aqueducts. The fresh water that had supplied Tenochtitlan for generations stopped flowing. The Mexica drank brackish lake water and began to sicken further. He cut off the food supply by closing the causeways. The Chinampas alone could not feed the city. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 75 days. It was one of the most brutal urban battles in history. The Spanish and their allies fought their way street by street, canal by canal, house by house. The Mexica resisted with a courage that even their enemies recorded with awe. They tore up the causeways behind the Spanish to trap them. They counterattacked at night. They captured prisoners and sacrificed them on top of the temple in full view of the besiegers, a final, defiant gesture meant to terrify Cortes's men. It worked for a time. Spanish soldiers wrote of standing on the causeway and watching their friends be dragged up the pyramid steps and opened from chest to navel, and being unable to do anything to save them. But hunger, thirst, disease, and overwhelming numbers wore them down. By August 1521, the Mexica were starving. They were eating tree bark. They were drinking rainwater out of cracked clay. The young emperor, Cuauhtémoc, tried to escape across the lake by canoe with his family. He was captured. He was brought before Cortes. Tradition says that he asked Cortes to kill him with his own knife because he had failed his people. Cortes did not kill him then. He kept him alive for a few more years, and then, on a later expedition into the jungles of southern Mexico, ordered him hanged from a tree on suspicion of plotting a revolt. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan surrendered. The greatest city in the Americas had fallen. The conquest did not end the suffering. In many ways, it began it. The Spanish did not simply rebuild Tenochtitlan, they demolished it. They tore down the Templo Mayor and used its stones to build a cathedral. They drained large parts of the lake. They renamed the city Mexico after the Mexica themselves and made it the capital of a new colony called New Spain. The cathedral, the National Palace, and the central plaza of modern Mexico City all sit today directly on top of the ruins of the Aztec capital. You can still see fragments of the Templo Mayor poking up from beneath the streets, excavated in the 20th century when the city was wiring itself for electricity. The native population collapsed. Smallpox was only the first wave. Then came measles, then influenza, then typhus, then a disease called cocolistli that historians still cannot definitively identify, possibly a hemorrhagic fever born out of drought and hunger and the collapse of every public health system the Mexica had once kept running. By the year 1600, just 80 years after Cortes first stepped onto the sand at Veracruz, the indigenous population of central Mexico had fallen by an estimated 90%. 20 million people, give or take, became 2 million. It was one of the worst demographic catastrophes in the recorded history of our species. The encomienda system was imposed. Native communities were assigned to Spanish landholders who were given the right to extract labor and tribute in exchange for, in theory, providing protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it was a slave system in everything but name, and it destroyed entire villages. The traditional priesthood was hunted. Sacred books, the Aztec codices, painted on bark paper in vivid colors, were burned in public bonfires by Spanish friars who believed they were destroying the work of the devil. We have only a handful of pre-conquest codices left in the world today. The rest were lost, deliberately, in front of weeping families. And yet, here is where the story turns. The Aztecs were defeated. Their empire was destroyed. Their capital was rewritten in stone by another civilization. But the people did not vanish. The descendants of the Mexica are alive today. They live in Mexico City, in the surrounding states, in the United States, in dozens of countries around the world. Nahuatl, the language of the empire, is still spoken by more than 1 million people. You probably use Nahuatl words every week and do not realize it. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote, chili, all Nahuatl. The food on your plate carries the empire's vocabulary 5 centuries after the last emperor was hanged from a tree. Mexican identity itself, the identity of one of the most populous nations in the Americas, was forged out of the collision between the indigenous world and the Spanish one. The flag of Mexico carries the eagle on the cactus, the sign Huitzilopochtli gave to the wandering Mexica 7 centuries ago. The Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the most visited Catholic shrine in the world, sits on a hill that was sacred to a pre-Hispanic mother goddess named Tonantzin. The food, the language, the music, the holidays, even the architecture of modern Mexico are layered, indigenous foundations carrying European weight, both still visible if you know where to look. The Aztec Empire was conquered. The Aztec people were not. So when we ask what really happened to the Aztecs, the honest answer is more uncomfortable than the version we are usually told. They were not simply defeated by a small group of clever Europeans with better weapons. They were betrayed from within by the cities they had spent 100 years brutalizing. They were ravaged by a microscopic enemy nobody saw coming. They were denied the time their leaders needed to understand what they were facing, and they were buried, but not erased, beneath a new civilization that secretly carried their fingerprints all the way down. History does not always end in extinction. Sometimes it ends in transformation. The pyramids are gone, but their stones are inside the cathedral. The empire is gone, but its words are in your kitchen. The eagle is still on the cactus, and the snake is still in its beak, and that flag flies over a country of more than 130 million people who, every single day, walk on top of Tenochtitlan. That is what really happened to the Aztecs. If this story made you see the conquest of Mexico differently, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Leave a comment and tell me which civilization you want me to cover next. The Inca? The Maya? The Olmecs? The forgotten empires of the Andes? I read everything you write. Thank you for staying with me to the end. I will see you in the next video.